So I'll just briefly go over some housekeeping stuff about today's Hui. So thank you for joining us. Hope everyone can see this. Just some thanks before we begin. So this Hui initiative is supported by Creative Communities Auckland. So myself, as part of Chromacon, we applied for funding, which is relevant to this conversation, right? And we received some support to run this. So thank you to Creative Communities Auckland. Also, huge thanks to Timanawa, the community space and library here in West Auckland, that we were actually partnered to work on this Hui with. And unfortunately, because of COVID, we have to switch online. So this is a new, format for us. And so yeah, bear with us if there's any technical difficulties. But Timanawa has been supportive of this idea from day one. And unfortunately, we can't host it there at the moment. But yeah, still great thanks to them. And also folks who submitted questions. So we've got a bunch of really good questions that hopefully we can cover as many as possible today. And also a very brave soul who submitted a project for me to take a look at, use as a case study. I won't mention it because I realized she will have to actually apply, if she wanted to. So I actually probably shouldn't mention the gender, but yeah, just for the sake of because she might actually submit something, we'll not actually mention by name. Also, CNZ, Creative New Zealand funding advisors, Sarah Burge, who will join us later at 4 o'clock to answer some questions. So she's taking her time out of her weekend to help us. And everyone tuning in, and those folks who've generously donated some cohort to support this initiative. Just some housekeeping notes. Now that we've started, please stay on mute by default. I believe we have 50-something people signed up on the Eventbrite page. So yeah, it'll be kind of chaotic, I'd imagine, if all 50 mics are on at the same time. But when after Sarah's session, we'll have time to have discussions. And this is a safe space. So we are definitely hoping, if we manage to cover all the questions, and we'll have people give a space for people to be able to actually share their views. As I mentioned, we are looking to share this Hui, a recording of this Hui, online afterwards. So yeah, there might be some privacy concerns, especially if you're going to be talking about your own project and say you're actually going to submit an application. Just take that into account. So later on, there's a lot of folks here who actually have funding experience, who might even be assessors. So if you have something to share, please raise your hand. And then we'll be able to, then you can unmute yourself and we'll go through that process. So here's the agenda for today. I'll try to cover some, basics that, we're, in the form of notes that I've prepared. And then from 3:30 to 4, I've got a project that, attendee today has submitted, and we will be able to look at it as a case study. And from 4 to 4:30, Sarah Burge from CNZ will come and answer some questions, specifically about the current arts grants from Creative New Zealand. So that's her role. I have received some questions that are related to things sort of outside of that, but more, general for CNZ. So just be aware that she might not actually be able to answer those because her role is just for the current art grants. And after that, hopefully we'll have time to actually cover more questions that we haven't gotten through yet, and further discussions. So just a brief introduction of myself. I'm Allan. I run Chromacon. So you can contact me on that email if you have any further questions outside of this today. Chromacon is an independent arts festival, and this current Hui is a community initiative that we're hoping to do more of to support that arts community in New Zealand. Pennie, can you unmute yourself and just introduce yourself, Pennie?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So
hi everyone.
Yeah. So Pennie is an arts manager, and she's helping us facilitate and coordinate this Hui.
Yeah. So I've been on this journey with Allan since 2017. It's been a fun ride. So yeah, looking forward to this session.
Thanks, Pennie. So Sarah Burge will be the CNZ funding advisor joining us, and her specific role is the visual arts art form stream, which is applicable to many of us. But I know there's some questions perhaps to do with publishing that might relate to literature as well. So hopefully she might have some insight. But if not, you know, I have a series of emails. Feel free to screenshot this, or we'll share. There's a document I will share after this with our notes that we're covering today, as well as yeah, with these specific emails in there. So you can actually go contact CNZ if you have any further questions that Sarah might not be able to answer for you.
I just want to.
Yep. Hi.
Sorry, just quickly add that if you have any question you want to ask anonymously, feel free to message me privately in the chat room. And yeah, so then we'll compile that and ask Sarah later or at a later Q&A session.
Yeah, I was just getting to that.
Ah, sorry.
Thanks, man. Yeah, so this is how format. Bear with us because it's the first time we're doing this. If you have a question, just that you don't mind, sharing that's coming from you, just post it in the chat. If you have an anonymous question, just privately message it to Pennie. She's checking both, right? And if you have something to contribute, just raise your hand. And so in the Zoom controls, under participants, there's a function where you can raise your hand. It looks sort of like this. You press participants, and then there's a raise hand, and then lower hand if you raised it already. On mobile devices, it looks like this. So basically, then Pennie can just keep in mind of awareness of some, if you actually want to unmute yourself and share something, just in case it gets too chaotic. We might be overthinking this. So that's it. I'm gonna jump straight into my presentation because I've wrote up a lot. So just for clarification, I am currently in the CNZ assessment pool, but I'm not employed by CNZ or anything. I'm external, what's known as external assessor. So sometimes they may ask me to assess projects. Currently, I'm not assessing the current arts grants, so there's no conflict of interest there. But normally, if I was, then that would be an issue. Obviously, I wouldn't be able to assess your project if I knew, about you and your project and anything in more detailed than that. But currently, I'm not. So I'm currently 3 for 3. Actually 3 for 2. So that means I failed 3 CNZ funding applications. So just to let you know, it's not like an abnormal thing. But so some of this is learning from over the years too. So I guess the big question we should start off with is, when should you actually seek public funding? And also, this applies, all these ideas apply to also, any public funding. It might not necessarily be CNZ. Could even be for like Kickstarter, or just to talk to an audience about your project and receive their support, right? So this is more universal ideas. So I think you will know that you have a project that's ready when the concept's strong enough that you have an idea of, okay, I need this much financial support maybe to take me over the line, right? You have a genuine need that could benefit from that you recognize that would benefit from artistic solution. So for example, there's a social problem, or maybe just bigger issue like climate change, but you have an artistic idea that you want to express, and maybe there's people you can collaborate with to do like a community project or whatever it may be. So you've identified a problem that you want to express, or you have an artistic idea that you feel is ready to either start working on it or put it, publish it, or put it out there. So I guess the main thing you kind of had to prove is that the project is viable and to be delivered, and your practice is sustainable, so that if you do have funding, you will have the capacity to actually complete the project. So what's key is basically you have a plan for execution. So essentially that means you shouldn't try to reverse engineer it, as in you see a funding deadline, it's next week, and you decide to make something just for that funding, because often it becomes quite clear when you haven't actually gone through the process of planning to actually deliver the project. It's not a matter of once you have the money, you can start planning. It's more, you have a plan, and the funds will either cover a portion of it, or whatever it may be that you're proposing, it'll take you over the line. So in particular, this is something that a lot of people might not have a concrete plan for, which is a timeline. Because sometimes it's, you have an idea and you would kind of put it on the back burner until you're ready to do it, whether it's, you personally have time or money. But in this case, maybe the funding would go towards you being able to allocate that time to work on the project. So ideally, you should be operating under a mindset of, if I actually, like, money was an issue and time was an issue, like, how would I deliver this? So before making an application, I guess one of the most important things is making sure you read the criteria and the requirements from the funding body, because they might have different things that they're looking to fund. And I guess the worst thing is, like, you spend all this effort and you apply to a funding body that doesn't actually fund, what you want to do. So most of them have very, very detailed, explanations on their, what they're trying to fund, because you do, like, thinking backwards as well, like, the funding bodies would also, have to secure time and also remunerate, assessors to try and cover, go through each project. So they also want to actually, help you understand their funding criteria as well, as clear as possible. So yeah, don't be afraid to just contact them, because usually they would prefer that. And I guess, overall, most assessors are asked to be consistent and be objective as possible, because, I guess the general premise is that they're trying to assess applications based on against the criteria and not against each other. So just take that into account, because what you're not necessarily, because obviously you would understand what's going on and ask, like, industry or what's out there in terms of, the work. But at the end of the day, you are actually looking at the criteria and analyzing whether your project matches that or not, and not really what other people might be submitting. But that being said, if you look at, the public funding funder might release a list of projects they funded, and you can look at what they're funding to sort of get an idea of, okay, how do these projects meet their criteria? And one other thing is, to find out about new funders, you could look at other projects that you enjoy, and see maybe they've been supported by or funded by someone else. And generally, that's a really good starting point. Yeah, I mentioned previously. So yeah, definitely try to talk to someone from the funding body. Like I mentioned, they definitely feel like, I think everyone prefers to be efficient as possible and not waste time. So also, this is why Sarah's, so generously attending Allan Xia today, because, by talking to you, a collective of our community, then it saves a lot of time as well. And so when you're making actually making the application, the big thing is always the what, right? Like, what is this project? But in the process of elaborating on the what, you should always try to find a good balance between articulating the theoretical and pragmatic aspects of the idea, right? So of course you should cover, where the idea came from, like what inspired you, your personal art philosophy and all these things. But also don't forget to actually cover the concrete aspects of what you're actually going to do. So that means, what is the project like? Is it a series of illustration? Is it a comic? Is it a, community like activation? And then the details in terms of how you're going to deliver it. Because if you only just cover, like, I want to make an art book, right? I really love art books. I love, I want to make a comic because I really love comics. You also, that's also not enough, because so you want to avoid like polar extremes in terms of either only talking about, say you're really passionate about climate change, and if you only cover like the inspirational and motivations behind the project, that's also not enough, because it's like, people at the end of the day, you also have to be assessed on what you're actually doing. So try to cover both and find a good middle ground. And ideally, if you know um, if you guide the reader, or your audience even, right, from the inception of the idea to how it might be executed, and they understand, oh, this makes perfect sense. There's a problem and you're solving it through this specific way of expressing, then I think that's the best way to actually communicate the what. yeah, and you're trying to build a strong case, right? So that that the project will be successful, and that entails like also demonstrating whether it's through art samples or just describing your personal background, that you have the skills, the expertise and the track record. You can use stats. So for example, you've previously did a project that's very similar, maybe in theme or in medium, and you've had success somewhere. If you feel that you're lacking in certain areas, then it doesn't actually hurt to find some collaborators prior to submitting your project. So for example, people who might support your skill gaps in areas where your project isn't as developed. So for example, if you're doing a project that includes writing into Todero, you should actually, you should find a cultural consultant like prior to the project and get some expression of interest from them. Maybe get some quote in terms of how much it'll cost for them to participate in the project, and just demonstrate you've planned this, right? For example, maybe you don't have an idea of how you might publish or print in book. Get an expression of interest, or talk to a printer, a publisher, a marketer, and you could even like, they might not necessarily be a partner with you on a project, but you could even just allocate a bit of funds towards mentorship or advice from them. It's all totally viable. You just really, it's quite important to demonstrate that you've taken the time to think about this, because simply saying I'm not sure about this part yet, but I'll solve it, it's not quite enough. And sometimes it doesn't matter that you might not have the track record, as long as you thought about it and maybe you collaborate with someone who does. That will actually make your case much stronger. And it's critical to not make assumptions. For example, you might be very, very familiar with a specific genre that your work is heavily based in, but consider the project might be assessed by more than one assessor, right? And they might come from different backgrounds, so they might not have any idea about sci-fi, for example, and and you really need to kind of elaborate a bit more about like what makes your work special, and maybe some general ideas about a genre that you're working in, and how it sits inside New Zealand, like on a regional sort of basis, and also internationally. And yeah, cover your bases, and just don't assume that assessor will know exactly what you're talking about. And yeah, that's going back to the first one, which is thinking about the criteria of the funder. Think about what the funder is getting out of the relationship and the project, right? Because we'll cover this when we get to the case studies, but these CNZ, for example, specifically states exactly sort of what their program purpose is. So just thinking back, back in high school, maybe the essay question will be really clear, and there's 3 questions, and when you're asked to write an essay, and just make sure you answer those questions. And in a way, if unfortunately, if your project is not funded, think about why they might not fund you, and definitely ask for feedback. So next time, you'll be able to cover your bases. But you could also work backwards and think, get some advice from others, just to see, like maybe there's some areas that you missed, and it might hurt your project in terms of assessors asking a question about like, okay, if I don't see a demonstration of this area, which is critical for the delivery, and that might hurt your chances. And this is the big one, the budget, right? So what are the costs you really need to consider? And I think, it depends on how you're proposing for the project. If, for example, it's your first time publishing a book, for example, and you have no idea how much it costs to publish a book, or distribute a book, or anything, then, or even say you're doing an exhibition, it doesn't hurt necessarily to maybe try to fund for the research and development part of the project. So whatever your budget is, it should be as accurate as possible and reflect your planning. So this means if you're applying for a project that's covers exhibition and publishing, distribution, all of that. And you have no idea how much it costs for some of those line items. And you're just throwing figures out there. It would actually hurt your chances because it demonstrates the project is actually not quite ready to be executed on that level. But the things that you should obviously try to cover is, first of all, consider your own time, right? So when we do passion projects, sometimes we just think about the project itself and not how much is spent, we're investing into the project. So currently, CNZ, for example, the mandate from Ministry of Cultural and Arts and Heritage is that artists should be remunerated at $25 an hour minimum. Other funding bodies might have different criteria in terms of like how much they fund and what they can and cannot fund. So obviously double check those. But you should always list the full budget. And within that, you can say, oh, I'm looking for support in these areas. And for example, if your professional rate is, I don't know, $200 an hour, and say CNZ, is looking to fund $25 an hour, but taking into account how professional you are, it's actually worthwhile to say, okay, my professional rate is this, but I am willing to personally also invest a portion of my fees into the project. So I'm actually requesting CNZ to fund, say 50% of my professional rates, and I'm personally funding the rest. So don't be afraid that, oh, if I ask for too much, then they're not going to fund me. But also I'm hurting myself because my rate is actually this. You should clearly just say in the budget what your rate is, and that will actually demonstrate to people, okay, this is what you're worth, but also this is how much you're willing to commit to your own project, right? And this goes with other people who might be collaborating with you. So instead of just asking a friend to be like, hey, can you work on this for free, or mates rates, you can state their actual rates, and maybe they are sponsoring you in the form of an in-kind sponsorship because they believe in your project, right? So definitely try to remunerate other collaborators and contributors to the project, because we're trying to build a sustainable community and industry, right? So it just be clear, in your budget, and obviously you can consider the materials, the transport fees, or maybe if you're exhibiting and you're traveling the project, maybe there's accommodation and logistics. These are all areas that you can put in your budget. You might not necessarily ask to be funded for all those areas, but the demonstrating a concrete plan is always helpful. And you can estimate, but quotes are always a plus. And this is where it goes. This is what I previously mentioned. You can say, if you don't know how much it costs to print something, you can go to a printer and approach them to get an expression of interest. And they might be able to give you a quote or estimate, but these are areas where someone else can cover for you. But you might not necessarily be ready to actually spend money just yet. But it demonstrates planning. And like I mentioned, if you have other funding sources, it's even better, because it demonstrated that you're not asking, say, one funding body to be all in on your project, and if you don't get the funding, the project doesn't go anywhere. If you're demonstrating that you've actually put effort in, and you're only lacking this bit of support, and it makes perfect sense for the funder, then your chances will be higher. So here's just some general tips. We cover the sort of main important things. Like I mentioned, you should try to get expressions of interest. This might be from a venue provider if you're doing an exhibition. If you're, like I mentioned, if you're doing a comic, and maybe you approach a writer to be an editor or advise for you on a specific subject matter. Mentors, these are all areas that could help you in your project. Try to have a plan B. By that I mean, say, and a lot of funders don't actually cover, don't actually fund purchasing of capital items, right? But hypothetically, say you need specific equipment to do the project, or for your opening show you need catering. Can you try to approach a brand, with the same proposal essentially of your idea, and is it strong enough to maybe they'll sponsor catering for you? I think these are all areas that actually would help convince the funder that, hey, this idea is viable because it's generating a lot of interest from from others as well. Make sure you have good documentation of the process. So this means work you've done already, and definitely add that to your proposal. But also, if you get funding, document the process and the results, because you will have to do a report on, just to say how you spent the money and where the project went. And a good report means a better track record for the future. Um, and yeah, and stay aware of there's industry surveys and HUIs that that often are run by the various funding bodies, because they also are developing their strategies and they want to know what people need. So if you take part in those, there's there's likelihood that you might be to actually influence future strategies. But even if not, you'll get a better idea of, like, okay, this is what the funding body is actually looking for. Yeah, so definitely don't get disheartened by rejection. Like I said, I've been rejected plenty of times too. But definitely try to ask for feedback. For example, CNZ, unfortunately, there's just too many applicants, so they can't give feedback on a case-by-case basis. But if you ask for it, there is a funding advisor who will, try to paraphrase all the feedback that assessors give and try to pass that on to you. So it's definitely worth reaching out and asking for one. Or like I said, here's a bunch of emails you can contact. This is for CNZ specifically, but every funding body should have some kind of contact for you to just, so the earlier you finish drafting your application, you could actually send that through and ask for some feedback, right? If possible. And they might tell you, oh, you should be applying for this grant instead of that grant, and then that will save you a lot of headache. Okay, so I've prepared a bunch of resources for you guys, and I'll share this in a PDF document. It should be in chat, but if not, if I share this online, I'll probably in the description somewhere. So here's a bunch of resources you could look at. CNZ has a funding calendar, so it's quite easy to just look at, okay, what other opportunities coming up. They have a very detailed funding guidelines, so definitely check those out. And it's currently, a lot of things are changing because of COVID. So you sort of can't really take things for granted, but it's definitely good to check what they're doing. Big Idea has a specific category for arts awards, grants, and residencies. There's a lot of opportunities there you can look at. And there's a couple articles I'm posted here that is basically a elaboration of what I've just said as well. But, like funding 101s. Definitely check those out. And also, I've listed for you a list of funders in New Zealand. So these are all different pages, and they're all very detailed. There is a funding database. Actually, there's more than one that you can look into. Some of these are even go beyond arts. It might be like community-based, something like what we do for Chromacon, for example. But yeah, if you really want to go through all the opportunities, there's a lot of funding databases. Yeah, we've made a list as well, just down here for you guys to take a look at. But yeah, there's tons. Obviously, think about your project first, and then try to see if any of them match for you. For example, if your project is Asian related in terms of arts, or maybe you are taking your art to Asia, or your subject matter has to do with Asia. Asian New Zealand Foundation is a good choice. So there are more specific ones like that too. But yeah, this is there's a lot. So I'll share this document, and hopefully this lays a good foundation for you in terms of the sort of basics. Because any more detailed, it will go. It will have to be specific to a certain grant in particular. And okay, well, I'm 4 minutes. Actually, I'm right on time. So that was half an hour. So Creative New Zealand's funding advisor Sarah is joining us at 4 o'clock. So between now and then, one of our attendees today bravely submitted a draft of her proposal that she's applying for Creative New Zealand Art Grants. And I will just use this as a case study to sort of talk more specifically about some of the theoretical ideas we've covered. So this is a project called an illustrated tour of cafes in a certain area of New Zealand, shall we say. I'm going to redact some of this just so that it's maybe it's for conflict of interest sake. So this is what it looks like when you log into CNZ's funding portal. And so prior to this, you will select the art grant you're actually looking to apply for. And once you've selected it, this is what it looks like. So after you submitted your application details, you will be asked to write your project title, a brief description, and select the art form that you're applying for. So the art form part, sometimes it might be a point of confusion for you, and you can definitely approach CNZ with a draft of your application and say, hey, am I applying to the right one? Because different art forms will have different assessors, and you obviously you want to make sure that the assessor is most relevant to what you're doing. There's a funding type, but right now there's one main general arts fund. Sometimes there's more than one, so make sure you select the right one. And there is a strategic outcome that you have to select. So that's the main strategic outcome. So this one, definitely you need to think about it, and you can double check with CNZ, but I'll try to cover what some of them means. So here's the selected strategic outcomes that CNZ Art Grants is looking for at the moment, right? So they've got high quality New Zealand art is developed, New Zealand arts gain international success, New Zealanders experience high quality arts, New Zealanders participate in the arts, and New Zealand's arts sector is resilient. So I guess this is kind of, you have to think about the kaupapa, like the core philosophy behind the project, like what is it for? And they elaborate, right? So in here, under strategic outcome, you can say, if relevant for your project, include the projected number of. So this is where you kind of have to do an estimate on like what the impact you're delivering is. So if you're selecting new high quality artists developed, then you need to kind of say, okay, I estimate, well, you have to say, this is the amount of work that I'm creating. So that means, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to explore the subject matter and I'm going to create. You have to actually specifically say, this is, pragmatically what I'm doing and how many new pieces I'm making. And that's sort of the general, metric you have to try and estimate. If you select New Zealanders experience high quality arts, then this is more to do with exhibition and publishing and things like that. So you have to project, like if you're doing exhibition, how many people might attend? If you're selling a book or art, then how much sales you might get, or how widely it might be distributed. Say a book, how many copies you're printing. So if you select New Zealanders participate in the arts, then who's involved, how many people might be experiencing it. And if you say New Zealand arts gain international success, then this might be international events. It might be, say you're doing a Kickstarter, right? So that you can project the international audience, and that's how much I guess so there is a meaning to each of those strategic outcomes, and this is, I guess, where you have to justify your the impact that your project will have. So choose this carefully. And so, for example, this project, the applicant is looking to do an art book, but she has chosen New Zealanders experience high quality arts. So this says to me that it is more focused on the publishing and distribution part of it, because New Zealanders experiencing implies like the outcome of this project is the book will be done, will be in people's hands, and so essentially assessors will be looking at, okay, can you execute that? And if you project, say I'm going to make 500 books and 500 sales, so they will be assessing, okay, will that be in New Zealand? Will you sell all those copies, and who will be buying them, and how would it be available to them? So this is a very pragmatic type of decision. You could also select high quality artists developed, because that will focus more on the artistic part of your project. Then they'll be assessing, okay, if you're creating X amount of works, is that enough to meet the artistic goals that you have? Say you're doing a project on environment, again, going back to a climate change example, are those pieces you're planning, enough to communicate the concept? And so if you choose that one, it'll be more assessed on, the actual artistic outcomes. So think about that, because this, the strategic outcome is quite important in terms of like what your project is. And actually choosing one will help you frame how you're proposing for the funding, right? And so this is what the applicant has written for the what of the project. She has written, this museum locale has a fantastic coffee culture, and she enjoys sitting in coffee shops where she can draw and observe people passing by. So, these are great places to relax, meet friends, and connect with others. She's also an immigrant and fell in love with, the beauty of this place and the coffee shops, vibe here, and want to capture the life by of this place by illustrating a series of iconic, ironic, it should be iconic, local cafes and sceneries, and make into an art book and hold gallery shows. Okay, so there's quite a few things already, right? There's an art book, there's also a gallery show. So keep that in mind. She has also done 12 cafes already, like illustrating 12 cafes, and she's actually has already previously made it into a small booklet, or a zine, if you will, and printed 30 copies and sold them through Chromacon last year and via Instagram. She had success with it, so this is good. You're demonstrating that, okay, you've not only have you planned this, you also have sort of prototyped it in a way, and got actual, results and feedback. The audience have loved it, and she has a lot of inquiries throughout the year asking if, they could make more books and art prints for sale. So this has made her think of to make a high quality art book with more art, a better hand drawn map, and more words. The applicant wants people to hold this book, memory, or looking forward to going to those places once again and fall in love with this area of New Zealand. And they are planning to sell and promote this book through their website, social media, and art festivals, and also considering to give away free copies to local cafes for people to flip through. And they mentioned a bit about how much followers they have on Instagram and how many are local who like their art. So she's basically saying she's confident that if they made a good quality art book of this museum location, her existing audience will be keen to get one. So some notes I have from reading this, right? So first of all, you should probably tweak the description to be just more straightforward. So basically, essentially, the description is in terms of what you put over here under the project title, the brief description, is essentially just a quick overview of what you're using the funding for. So in this case, you should just say the funding is towards the publishing and exhibition of an illustrated art book featuring cafes, in this area. Just elevator pitch, right? Also, this is something you could check with CNZ about, because it's so focused on publishing a book. It might actually be more relevant for literature in terms of the art form, because literature art form is the one that primarily focuses on physical publishing. So you should double check that, right? If the project is just for the illustration part, and you're doing research and you're creating a series of works and not necessarily committing to making an art book, then maybe it's more relevant for visual arts. So just there's some subtle nuances in terms of the guidelines that you should probably check. And I can't, I can't say for sure, so double check with CNZ on that. Okay, so consider this: the subject matter is a city in New Zealand, and the coffee culture there. So I think the inspiration behind the project is well communicated, but it's very personal. So I think to really demonstrate the artistic, value and central concept, if you elaborated a bit more on how you're engaging with the subject matter. So this means, the research, perhaps you have done some research on the history of coffee culture in this place, or the stories behind each cafe that you're illustrating. Perhaps you're even collaborating with the cafe owners. That will sort of support your idea further. You could also think about how you might be able to make the work more accessible. For example, as we can see, English is not this applicant's first language. So for example, if she's writing a bit about each place, perhaps she could collaborate with another writer or editor to help support this area. Or for example, think about what if I've never been to this place in New Zealand, for example, I don't know anything about coffee culture at all. How can you make this work more accessible for audiences who might, who might be interested for your art, but they don't know anything about the concept, right? So, because I think the concept takes two things. One is her personal inspiration and artistic, expression and storytelling, but the other is to do with a specific time in a specific place and a specific culture. So if you find a way to communicate that you're going to be able to execute on this idea by making accessible to audiences across both these areas, then I think it will make the artistic goals like stronger. So there's a couple of words there also. For example, high quality, be it a hand-drawn, more words. I think this goes back to the assumption part, right? Because, for example, the assistant might not know what high quality means for your own work, your style, your genre that you're working in. Bit of hand-drawn, like you have to elaborate a bit more about what that means, right? So what makes the illustrations that you're doing for this project unique and interesting? What makes your own personal perspective interesting? The applicant has started on that by saying a little bit, by telling a bit about her experiences and the fact that she's an immigrant, so there's an immigrant perspective there. Maybe how does your original culture and New Zealand culture and the culture of this town and coffee culture, like how do these things relate? And how does that make your artistic, expression stronger and more interesting? Your overall body of work, right? How, what makes it unique and interesting to do this project? Because this concept, for example, you want to let people, experience this place and this coffee culture. You could do that through a variety of ways. And so why is an illustrated art book better than, say, poetry or a theater show or what have you, right? So elaborate a bit more on that. And I guess, how does this project relate to your wider body of work in your career, like, right? Where are you right now in your career, and why are you doing this project, and how does that help you, right? Again, another thought I had was, because this project is very regional, I wonder, like, what is the sort of national and international impact it might have? Because obviously, I think there will be people interested in this project outside of the specific place, that she's mentioning has a interest already. And maybe it's the coffee culture in the place isn't commonly depicted at all in illustration or art form, art book. And so you're sort of addressing a need that that doesn't exist. Sorry, you're addressing a need for something that doesn't exist but has a lot of potential for interest. Okay, another problem is, because the applicant has concretely sort of stated that the project is going to be for physical publishing and exhibition. So then it brings up a lot of questions around, okay, how, like, who is coming to the exhibition? How many people, right? What is the scale that we're talking about here? What's the plan for the publishing, sales, and distribution, right? Some ideas I had was, could you partner with the cafes to help distribute the art book once it's done? Could you approach local boards and business associations, or the specific place that it's based in might have creative communities funding, and that might be completely relevant to this project. And so these will actually help you with the project in terms of funding and just getting the project underway, even without CNZ funding. But if you had it already, CNZ would be extremely pleased, because you've done so much work. Maybe there's potential for sponsorships. When you do your book launch on the exhibition, could there be a cafe or coffee company that might be willing to come aboard? It could even just be in kind. They'll be serving their coffee at the exhibition. Like, it's such a small thing, but for you to explore those ideas demonstrates you've thought a bit further, because obviously you're already talking about a launch and a publishing. So you have to demonstrate that you're thinking more than just the making part of it, but also the delivering part of it. So program purpose, right? So this is something that I didn't cover previously, but CNZ has a specific list of program purposes that they detail out for you as well. So one of them, you have to pick one as your core one, but you can also say it delivers to more than one. So for example, sustaining career for the artist. So talk about, how does this relate to your career? How can it further your career? Talk about yourself. The applicant hasn't really covered that. The development of your arts practice, right? So maybe this helps you improve your illustration, skills. Maybe you're experimenting an entirely new medium, elaborate a bit on that. There's another one called innovation in Museum arts. So like I mentioned, maybe this story has not been told in this medium or genre at all, and you're actually innovating in the space. If you can identify that, talk about that. Opportunities for diverse communities to access and participate in high quality arts experiences. So because there is a mention of exhibition and the book launch, involved, maybe it takes place across the entirety of that, that city, that place, because the cafes are based all around that place, right? So maybe you can collaborate with them to bring communities from all over the region. And she mentioned art festivals. So hypothetically, Chromacon next year, or even international art festivals or maybe international distributors. It's if you've done the work and you have some expression of interest, or you approach people for some advice and you've got some good feedback on that, definitely add it there. Yeah, just some other ideas. Could you do a Kickstarter for this project? Because essentially, if you're asking CNZ to fund, say, in advance on you working on the project, then maybe some of the publishing costs can be covered through a Kickstarter, and you'll be much safer because yes, at least you've already been paid for the making of the project, and that might help as a marketing strategy, to launch the project. So now we get to the how, right? And this is where you need to say exactly what the start date looks like and when the end date looks like. So the current Arts Grants is for a 12-month period project. So if you're applying for this fund, make sure it sits within that. You need to, so this is the part where you're going to be assessed on how realistic and well-planned the project is. And right now, for example, there's some concerns around COVID. So if your project is entirely, a public activity, then you need to have at least a backup plan in terms of like, okay, what if we enter lockdown? Then I have a plan B. So this is, you can attach support material for this part to support, talk about your process. For example, a timeline, invitations or written agreements from people who are collaborating or presenting or distributing your work, or maybe a letter of acceptance from a provider, venue, for example, or what have you. You can make sure you attach the relevant materials here. So the applicant here has written, to make the art, she will need to visit cafes and take photos. So she's already got, places in mind, and photo references have been taken. So she basically generally covered like how much illustrations she's already done and how many more she needs to do, and generally how long it takes for her to do the illustration. And overall, 4 to 5 months to finish. Okay, so because she would like to do it through over summertime, then she projects it will be completed before May, and editing the book will take a month. So some notes I have. Has she done any research of the place, the cafe culture, like I mentioned, and the stories around that? If she does, she should definitely present that in terms of, for example, even some documentation of her research will be really good. If she hasn't, I would suggest that she thinks about it, because you're representing a place. So it's important to be able to at least acknowledge the local people and the history behind it. It just demonstrates the artistic value and the work that you've put in, right? You should really try to justify the viability of the project being successfully delivered. By that I mean, because you're proposed for publishing and exhibition and distribution. So these three things need to be covered. Currently, the how only covers the making of the project. So as I said, because the applicant has chosen the strategic goal in the beginning, right? And like I mentioned, if you remember, the metric that we judged on is like, how much is the attendance, how much is the sales, how much, or just to say these two things, then you should definitely mention that in the how. Because if you don't mention, your plan, the process for publishing, distribution, then the assessor will have nothing to go on in terms of like judging whether you'll be able to do it or not. I think right now what the applicant has described is actually the process of completing a manuscript, a draft for publication. So either I would suggest maybe tweaking the project to just apply for, say, this is the stage 1, right? The end goal of this, is to, first of all, high quality New Zealand artwork be created. And second of all, by the end of this project, I will have 30 pieces of illustration and a full manuscript ready to be published and distributed. Then you can really focus on the how, like in this area for the making. But because the project is for physical publishing and distribution, then you have to actually prove like that you know what you're doing and you've got a plan to execute on it. So what about, for example, the layout, of the book, like for printing, the graphic design aspects, pre-prints, pre-press tests, prototyping, the process of publishing, distribution, like do you have a marketing strategy? What is the plan for the book launch? The exhibition that you mentioned, ongoing sales. These all need to be part of the process because that's part of the plan. You know what I mean? If you don't have answers to these questions, for example, you could get expression of interest from other collaborators or partners, say printers, designers, editors, if you're the cafe owners, the gallery that you want to do the show at, the curator of the galleries, someone to maybe produce the project or just the publishing and exhibition part of it. Just to say, hey, I've spoken to these people and they will be working with me on that part of the project. So if you don't have an answer to the process, then at least demonstrate you've talked to someone. And ideally, if they're part of the project, then, if you've got a commitment of some sort from them, that will help like cover some of those gaps you might be missing. There was a mention of web store. And so, who she has her own store, but like, how is she going to manage those sales, right? Like in marketing and sales. So these are all the areas that she has proposed in the plan because it is an ambitious project. So you need to actually say how you're going to deliver it. The rest of the budget, and the budget, so she has generally written something like this, which is, like how much it will cost roughly for her to deliver it. But I would suggest, and CNZ, even for example, has a template you can download as a, you can see there, they have funding, see right here, download and complete the relevant Excel budget template. So this is available. And it would be good to fill that out because a spreadsheet allows you to build a more detailed picture of your project. So you should have costs and profits so they can actually assess, like say, even if you had CNZ funding, is that enough? Would you actually be losing money at the end of the day? You need to actually work that out, right? You should have a line item explanation. So say you're saying this, it costs this much for the printers. So then who are the printers, right? And do you have a quote from them? If it's for the exhibition, do you have a like gallery committed? Like, is that money, is that fund that you're asking for, like based on a quote for someone? Especially if you can break it down. So it's not just say one figure from exhibition in this area costs this much to promote and rent. But there's other costs, right? There's marketing costs, there's catering costs, for example, for opening night. All these various costs. The more detailed your budget is, the more it demonstrates that you've put the thought and the work into it. If you're selling the book, then how much will you be selling it for? Do you have a wholesale price? If you have a plan for distribution, for example, you should have a contingency ideally, so that if something goes wrong, for example, you all of a sudden realize that, oh, this, like I previously mentioned, you have Tadero in the project and you should get a kosher consultant. Then, hey, great, I have a bit of contingency that I'm putting towards it. Usually, it's just like a small single-digit percentage of your overall budget costs, but having some there is helpful as well. Quotes, like having quotes is really helpful because it definitely demonstrates you've done the work. And it doesn't hurt. It's like one email, like, I need this. How much does it cost from you, right? Even rough estimates. Oh yeah, so you should specify exactly what you're requesting from CNZ. So say your overall project budget is X, like you could say, I need these line items. You highlight them in the spreadsheet, right? I need these things supported by CNZ, or even this one, my own costs, I would like you to support 50% of it. Because maybe you don't need CNZ to cover everything, or maybe CNZ can't cover everything because it goes against their funding guidelines. So you need to be very clear about like what the money is going towards. This might be out of date because currently there's a new COVID response relief strategy. So I don't know if this is still the case. But for example, CNZ has a specific guideline on publications that they fund, the publishing of the books. So say, for example, standard format publications, it's standard CNZ subsidy, it goes up to 5,000. Large format, heavily illustrated publications goes up to 12,000. Children's picture books up to 4,000. I don't know if this is still the case for the current art grants. This might be the previous ones. Things are a little bit changed, but you should double check just for sure. Because, for example, if they say that we don't actually fund the entirety of your $50,000 printing costs, then you shouldn't ask for that, because even if your project is perfect, if it doesn't actually match their funding criteria, then then it won't be able to go ahead. So I think that's all from me actually. We actually have Sarah joining us, so I will quickly just introduce her. I think Penny is Sarah. Yeah. So I'm going through this really fast, but we'll have time to like cover questions.
Yes, Sarah's here.
Got it? Yeah, I'm here.
Sweet. I will unshare. Oh, here we go. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Nice to see everybody. Great to be part of this hui.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. So everyone's on mute, just so that we don't have 50 people shouting at once.
No,
but would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. So I'm one of the funding advisors for the funding services team at Creative New Zealand. So what we do really is we meet with applicants to discuss future applications or current applications, just talking through any questions, any specific questions you might have, either before you start making an application or during. So yeah, we're here on email, Zoom. Zoom's the new thing at the moment. So, and then yeah, we can also do face-to-face as well. We've got representatives in Wellington and Auckland. So if face-to-face works better as well, that's an option too.
Cool. I know you're only here for 30 minutes, so I'm going to try and get through as many questions as possible. Just for clarification, because you are primarily the visual arts funding advisor, right?
Yeah.
I think there is a common issue, point of confusion for folks, which is around arts publishing.
Yes.
So could you just quickly clarify the sort of boundaries in terms of where visual arts and literature sort of lie?
Yeah. So yeah, there is a little bit of confusion sometimes with the literature category. So for anything, so you could actually come into any art form for literature if it's an art form publication. So an art form publication is a book about the arts or a particular artist. And so say if you were writing about a dancer, you would come into dance. So even though it's a publication, you'd come into our dance art form. So we've got 10 different art forms. So that's sort of one way where you might end up coming in through one of those other art forms, is for those art form publications. For more literary based publications, you might come in then through literature. So, I mean, there's again another little breakdown as well. So you've got maybe your graphic novels within literature, and traditionally those have come in through the literature art form as well, because they are so narrative based. So yeah, say for visual arts, if you were to come in for a publication, that again would be your art form publication, and it might be about a famous New Zealand painter, or it's about painting as a topic. So that's sort of where the variation occurs there.
Cool, thank you so much. Do you think, and this is just to elaborate a bit further, So if, say, you're planning a project for a, like to, a manuscript, like, for a publication, but you're not actually funding the, asking funding for the publication itself. You just say you're doing 20 illustrations for the project. Would that go into visual arts or literature, you reckon?
It depends on the outcome. I would actually look at the end goal or the end outcome, even though this might just be a phase of the project that you're coming in for funding. Say if those illustrations were for a graphic novel and the graphic novel was more about the writing or the narrative as opposed to the illustrations, then you might still come in through literature. It also is useful to think about who's going to be looking at your application. So again, it comes down to the assessors and their expertise and your track record. So say in the past you've come in through our literature art form, or you see yourself more under literature, and that's your area of expertise as opposed to in the visual arts, then again, you might like to come in through literature. Or if it's more about the illustrations and you see yourself as a visual artist and you'd want visual arts assessors on your application, you'd come through visual arts.
Cool. We have two questions here that are very similar, but essentially it's to do with, if you're not an official registered organization, say GSD registered or anything, or using, incorporated, but just, you're a collective of people, or as a group, how would you apply?
Yeah, so you don't have to be a formalized organization registered. You can just be a collective and come straight in. There's no other admin necessary. You'll still need to nominate someone to be the primary applicant for your group or for your organization, to be responsible for the application. And that means, you're responsible for signing the application and also reporting back at the end of the project.
So are there any tax implications?
Yeah, so I mean, we don't generally, we can't really advise on the tax side of things. That's more for an official financial advisor or with IRD. But generally, I can say that yes, you will need to pay tax on grants. But again, it's really, really worth checking in with IRD or an advisor if you've got one in that area. But it's just a bit outside our remit, so can't confirm anything there.
Cool. So do you have any advice on how to prove recognition for new artists, or maybe, unknown artists? Is it a CV? Is it a portfolio with processes?
Yeah. So there's several ways you can do that. So first off, in the application itself, there's the people section. So this is where you'd provide a brief overview of your artistic career to date, highlighting anything that might be super relevant for that particular application as well. So making that really clear. But then also you want to reiterate this with a bit more detail in the support material tab. So this is where, like Allan suggested, you might put your artistic CV. So we don't really want a CV of absolutely everything you've done to date. If you can kind of narrow this down to just your artistic CV, the things you've done in your artistic career, that makes life a lot easier for the assessors, and it's just easy to see that you've met the track record requirements for the particular art form. So yeah, it's just using a combination of that people section tab and then the support material tab. And as well as including your artistic CV, it's really useful to link to a website you might have, or collate a PDF together of past works, especially those works that are again relevant to the current application you're putting together.
Cool, thank you. You can leave questions, guys, but we did ask everyone to submit in advance, so they take priority because they're a bit more onto it. So we'll try to go through as much as possible, but hopefully we'll still have time for extra questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do you know if there's any effort made to sort of mitigate the effects of genre bias amongst assessors? So, for example, even if it's visual arts, I think some of the artists in our community, they're a bit worried that, for example, even though Lord of the Rings put New Zealand on the map internationally, simply being virtual of made in New Zealand by talented Kiwis, they have a hard time thinking a project like that, no matter how skillfully made or it's nationally high profile, would stand a chance of receiving funding because there's a perception of being lowbrow, or fine art. So they're wondering, this is more holistic question, I suppose, but are there check and balances, I suppose, like in your case in visual arts, to ensure every project has a fair shot, without being dismissed because of genre bias?
Yeah, so I guess it's hard to say. It just depends like who kind of comes into each round as well. It's really just on, it's merit-based assessment. So it's within each art form. You might get a big pool of really, well-known famous artists, organizations really at the top. And then in other art forms, you might not. It really just depends round by round who you're going to be up against. And, there's no particular art form in that we're going to favor more. It's really just merit-based. It's who's going to be scoring, like who's received the highest score is going to receive the funding. And so, you might have 20 top ones in craft, say, but then only a few, really strong applications in visual arts. And so we're not going to say, oh, but we need to meet, it's got to be 20 applications per art form. So we'll just fund these other ones as well. It's whatever that sort of cutoff score is, anything above that will be funded.
Can I just, if I may just add, because, I'm in the assessment, external assessment pool, and when I was approached by CNZ, it was specifically because CNZ wanted to diversify in terms, what the assessors' backgrounds and the genres and subject art forms that they're working in are. So I think the CNZ has a pretty diverse pool, and there's at least indications on my end that there is definitely a strategic goal towards making the assessors being very diverse.
Yeah. Sorry, Alan. I think I misheard your question earlier before as well. So yeah, we do. We're always trying to diversify our assessor pool so that we make sure that we've got expertise across the board, because we know there's so many little niche genres people are working in as well within each art form. So we really kind of look early on to see what applications are coming into each round and what we've got in each pool, and we will reach out to our assessors earlier on if there's anything in that group or in that funding round that needs a particular expertise on it. So we're not going to be putting someone who's got an expertise in jewellery making and then put them on you for object making in general or furniture making just because they're still within craft. We're going to find someone that's going to be relevant for your particular project and application. So, as much as we can. I mean, obviously there's areas still that we need to work on and get people into our pool. And often, and we're constantly rotating our assessor pool as well to make sure we've got fresh voices. Again, trying to eliminate any bias where we can, make sure we're refreshing. So it's not the same eyes on each application every time. And, sometimes we lose our niche assessors when we are rotating in and out, but we do try and fill those gaps wherever we can to make sure it's fair across art forms and fair across applications within the art forms.
Nice. Thank you. I have a question in regards to, here's a question. It's very specific, but it's still with, say they want to do a podcast around a art form. In a way, it's kind of relating to the literature thing again. Would that go into visual arts because it's visual arts related, or another art form?
Yeah, again, it's more about what's the kaupapa, what's the idea, what's the focus of the podcast, what's it about? I think, again, like those art form publications, it's a lot of people think, anything to do with publication, it's got to go into literature, but that's not the case. It's, okay, but what is this book about? Oh, it's about a painter, so therefore visual arts. So again, same with the podcast. Who is being interviewed? What is it about? What's the theme? That might help indicate which art form it might sit under. And for podcasts as well, I mean, this is something we're really looking into at the moment because obviously there's a lot of podcasts popping up, especially this year with lockdown and everything. So, it's a great way to get news and to get conversations going on about relevant topics out there. So, but it's also about where that podcast is going to sit. So we do have some eligibility around podcasts as well. So say if it's to end up sort of more mainstream radio or TV or something like that, it might not be something we could support. So podcast for us, it is quite good to get in touch with a funding advisor and just come speak to us first before starting an application, just so that we can, you know, make sure it's eligible and make sure you're kind of going in under the right art form and down the right path.
Actually, just going back to the publishing part again, I think a lot of folks have an idea to do some sort of art book publishing, but I think this relates to other art forms too. So if you have expertise, I'll just expand this question a bit more, because it's basically to do with if you have experience, expertise in illustration, but you've never published, a book before. So I guess to that end, if you're experienced in one field, one craft, for example, but you are say publishing or distributing in a different medium, like how does that affect the likelihood of you receiving funding?
Yeah, so I guess our eligibility criteria is quite strict and is different under each art form. So if you've got a background and a track record in a particular art form, it is best to stick with that just to get your application in through the door. But if you're really hoping to go into a new, you're kind of changing your direction and you want to be seen under a different kind of art form or, expertise area, then you could, potentially link up with somebody else already working in that area that's got the experience. And that's a way to come in, maybe as we talked about earlier, as a collective or a duo, and they can be the lead on the application. That just ensures that, you'll make it past eligibility and be able to go into this new sort of territory. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Sorry, I just got a long list. You're going through it really quick though. If anyone has would like Sarah to elaborate on one of the questions previously, you can also leave it in chat. If not, we'll keep going. Here's some quick fire ones. I was previously just talking about how there is a template for CNZ for publishing, and there's some for there's like a suggested amount. I don't know if that's still relevant for the current art grants.
Yeah. So we still have our subsidy caps for publications. So yeah, those are still relevant. And I think the ones that you put up on the screen were the up-to-date ones.
Oh, okay, cool.
So they're different for each type of publication. So you've got your sort of standard format and then your large format. And a lot of people do this is a question I get all the time anyway, is sort of what's the difference and what does a large format, heavily illustrated publication mean? And you do actually have to have both. It's not just large format or heavily illustrated. You've got to have both. So we like to say it's sort of, it's actually a big publication in terms of measurement size. You're not just going to be able to hold it in your hand. Yeah. And there's majority illustrations versus text, that sort of thing. So that's where, and these different caps are because it actually costs a lot more to get it printed. So that's why we've got those sort of caps in place, and they are kind of in line with how much it would cost to get something printed.
Just I think because someone will definitely ask this, where does a very thick graphic novel, but not necessarily massive measurement wise, sit within this?
Yeah. So that still might just come in under the standard publication, but the thing is with standard, you can also then get potentially art form publication in addition. If you were to come in, say, through visual arts and it was more about the illustrations, then you can get double that standard subsidy.
So would you recommend a hypothetical graphic novel artist actually apply for visual arts to just finish the manuscript first before applying for the publishing under literature?
Yeah, I mean, I would always just take it back to being true to your project and how you want it to be seen. So how you want your project to be seen, but also yourself as an artist. Do you sort of relate, do you see yourself as a visual artist, or do you see yourself more under literature? And, you know, it is kind of, I mean, you might know this, Ellen, from assessing, but it is quite obvious when you can sort of, you know, you've seen someone working in this area and they're on an upward trajectory in that area, and it's, you know, you kind of know their work. And if it's sort of is sitting in the right place or not, and is it, you know, is it more just to get the additional funding, or is it more about, okay, yes, this project, you know, it sits here well, it's going to have the right expertise assessing and looking at this project. So it really just depends what the focus of your project is and how you see yourself as an artist and how you want to be assessed.
Actually, no one's asked this question, but kind of related. Would you suggest, say, for example, if someone was publishing an art book, but the overall plan is, you know, they want to do an exhibition, like a book launch, you know, maybe like touring to other art market and stuff like that. Would you suggest applicants focus on you know, like a more specific application, or an overall project idea? Like which one?
You mean coming in for multiple activities?
Because of the plan is that they're essentially going to deliver all these things as part of the project. Would you suggest most like folks to apply for a specific part of it and just, you know, say it's just a visual art part of it and I'm going to apply for the visual arts part of it, or it's the entire plan, but perhaps they're requesting CNZ funding for, you know, a part of it?
Yeah, so I mean, you can kind of come into multiple parts of a project or mini projects, or and again, I would kind of come into a particular art form that highlights the focus of the overall project. So yeah, that one's a bit of a tricky one. I mean, because you've got to address one outcome and one program purpose. So the more kind of things you come in for, different aspects of a project, perhaps the more unclear it becomes, because overall you are just needing to answer to that one outcome and the one purpose that meets the project, or is the sort of main focus of the project. So if you've got multiple phases of the project or aspects and outcomes that all kind of have an underlying link, then I think that's fine. Yeah, so I mean, sorry, did that sort of give you a...
Yeah, I think there's no right answer, but I briefly talked about, I guess the more you're proposing, the more you have to prove that you can execute.
Exactly.
Certainly, I think, I mean, this is personal experience, but yeah, it's harder to assess big, ambitious ideas because there's so much to consider versus a very focused project.
Yeah, and then you're thinking or questioning perhaps viability, you know, is it attainable in the time frame? Yeah, so there's other factors that come into it as well, the more you kind of put into your application. And that's not to say, though, that you can't. We often see applications with multiple projects or programs of activity, but the ones that do really well and come across strong do have an underlying link, and they do share in a similar outcome and purpose with each other. Otherwise, it does just get a little bit unclear, a bit murky, and does come off a little ambitious. So it's just finding that balance, I think.
Cool. We've got 7 minutes left. So here's a quick fire one. There's a question around doing a project with a collective project, and one of the participants is not a New Zealand citizen. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. So the person who makes and is responsible for the application, though, does need to be a New Zealand citizen or permanent resident. But if someone in that group doesn't have that, that's fine. Okay. As long as the primary applicant does.
Yeah. And someone asks, how does CNZ select assessors, and if assessors are from the same field as applicants, do they have to excuse themselves when they have conflicts of interest?
Yes, yeah. So we put a call out. It's every year for nominations, and you can find that on our website. You download the form and then you fill out the details and send it in to us. And that's where we do our sort of checks just to see, you know, what your track record is like, what is your field of expertise, you know, are we kind of looking for more people in your area of expertise as well? Because we might have already, you know, 20 people working in that particular area, so we might not need someone to come on board either at that time, or maybe we park them for a little while. But otherwise, people can nominate you as well, so that's an option. So yeah, that's kind of how we recruit. And yes, so if an assessor knows someone with a direct conflict to someone who's come in for a round, they won't be able to assess on their applications. They'll be removed. And if you have too many sort of conflicts within a particular round, you'll just be removed as an assessor altogether, just to make sure, you know, there's no sort of bias, or, you know, it's fair. So we take that really, really seriously as well, the conflicts. But our assessment team, I'm sure, would be able to answer if, you know, if there's any other sort of specific questions in that area. If you wanted to know a bit more detail about sort of how many assessors we've got in what particular area and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I think we have a bunch of questions that are still very much kind of teetering the line, because I think a lot of artists are very multidisciplinary, and or maybe the projects they're working on are, and they're just focused on the visual arts part of it. So we've got 3 questions here that are essentially around that. One is making the visual art / comic part of it for that ties into a interactive game project, but they're just doing the art part of it. And the CNZ doesn't fund game design, I remember in the guidelines. So is that okay? Can they apply for their part of the project in terms of the visual arts comics creation part of it?
Yeah, that one's a tricky one. So I think if it was going to be just towards game design, we may not fund it. But if there was sort of other outcomes of this illustration work, then perhaps we might. I think if the main focus or outcome was game design, though, it might not be eligible for Creative New Zealand funding. But if there was, you know, other areas that this work would end up in that we do support, then that would be fine. And yes, I think visual arts would be the way to go.
And one other attendee asked that they want to make a graphic novel, but it's primarily going to be a electronic interactive one. So they thought it would be visual arts, but as it's such a visual narrative piece, now they don't know whether it goes into literature.
No, I think if the visual side of things is the focus and it's mainly about the visuals or the illustration, then I would come under visual arts. If it's more about the narrative, then literature.
Cool. So this is a very specific question, but someone said that they're working on a graphic novel where they have expression of interest from a small independent international publisher. But the advance payment proposed will not cover the workload or the research they'd like to put in. Can they apply to CNZ for the research they need to do for the narrative themes of the graphic novel and pay themselves for the work?
Yep. So you can come in for just the research phase of a project. That's completely fine. So we support research and development. So you might see your project as, you know, research, development, creation, publication. So you can break it down into those parts.
And this is this is the tricky part. So if they're artists, but the research part is primarily, you know, is research. It's not the actual illustration part of it. Would that fall under the literature because it's primarily, you know, writing?
No, so again, I think it's coming back to that overall project, overall outcome, and where you want to see that overall project sit. What art form does it best sit under, rather than just kind of breaking it up into that particular phase. And then, you know, because then you might come back in for the creating and then you think, oh, but maybe I'll change it and go into a different art form, you know. Then it's sort of like you kind of just want to see your project as a whole go under one and move through.
Actually, no one's asked this, but now this has brought me to think about it. What are your recommendations in terms of who actually makes the application? So by that I mean, say, no, in this case, a book is needing to be published. Is it the publisher or is it the artist, like the one of the artists working on the project?
It's kind of up to the applicant, I guess. As long as either has got the track record requirements, that's fine. And it's also sort of how, again, do you want your application to be seen and assessed? Is it who's kind of driving the project? Would it be, I mean, generally it's the artist, but I mean, it's not to say a publisher couldn't come in. But yeah, I think just thinking really who's driving the project, who's it for primarily.
I mean, this would go along with like a collective project as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's who's driving it, and then maybe in a collective situation as well, it's who's maybe got the most track record or experience. Just it might give the assessors a little more confidence in the project that someone with more expertise and experience is leading, in sort of more management role.
Cool. Oh, it's 4:30, but just wanted to thank you so much for your time, Sarah. And I guess before you go, do you have any just general advice, like one piece of advice for a first-time applicant?
Yeah, for a first-time applicant, I would definitely get in touch with funding services, with one of the advisors. Just link up with somebody. It might not necessarily be the person in the art form that you're initially thinking of, but just reaching out, and then we can kind of help you work out what's the best path to start going down, because it can be so overwhelming coming to our website or just going straight to the application and starting straight off the bat in the deep end, and you might go down a particular path and then question, is this the right way to go? Am I doing the right thing? So I think it's just nice having a little bit of confirmation and reassurance from someone, one of the advisors, just to kind of steer you in the right direction to start with. And then we can also give you relevant resources and links rather than trying to fish through our website or guidelines. And then it just makes sure you're kind of checking everything off as well, and sort of seeing how you can make a strong application in your particular area. Are you reading the right information? Are you ticking all the boxes? So yeah, and we're here to help along the way. So it's not, you don't just have to call just to get started. It's if you're going through your application and specific questions come up, then we're here as well. We can't read through draft applications or anything like that, unfortunately, but specific questions, we're here to help. So I think especially for those first-time applicants, it's really great just to get in touch.
Cool. All right, thank you so much, Sarah.
No worries.
Yeah, I've got some feedback on that. Was a useful tip. But thank you so much. I know you have plans later today, so I won't hold you up. But yeah,
no
thank you
worries.
for taking the time.
It was great joining, and just get in touch with us. I'm sure, Allan, will you pass along some relevant links and email addresses? Otherwise, I'm happy to fire those through to you to send out to the network as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I shared the 3 that you gave me, the emails. But if there is is there a useful page where like all the list of contact details are, or?
Not really one page in particular with everything, but I can send an email through with like the main kind of,
that'll be great. Yeah, I'll definitely pass those on. Cool.
Okay. Wonderful. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. So, well, we're doing really good on time. Pennie, I haven't been keeping track. If anyone has anything to share, put their hand up. But if you do, this will be a good chance. Pennie?
Yeah, we pretty much got through. We didn't have a lot of questions in the beginning, so if anyone have any feedback or any very specific question you want to raise now, feel free to do so. I do have one here that asks a question around what are the responsibility in terms of reporting once you got funded. So I just thought that we would be able to answer that rather than keeping Sarah.
Oh, right. Usually it's actually, as far as I know, CNZ has they detail. It's almost like the same. They give you a brief in terms of like what you need to answer to report. As soon as you get funded, they'll send you something like that, and they'll remind you that you have to do the report by a certain date after your proposed period of funding. And actually a good point to raise is definitely, if you, again, this goes back to planning the project. If you change your plans halfway, right? Definitely let the funding body know that you're going to be potentially using the money for something else, because maybe they won't fund that thing. So you shouldn't tell them once the project is all over, because then you might run into trouble. Just an example. I had a research project in Asia I was going to do this year, and I can't go anymore because of COVID. So I basically had to give the money back because I can't deliver it within the time period. But it is what it is. So don't just like ignore them because you might get in trouble for that, right? Yeah, oh, obviously read your responsibilities that you're agreeing to, because we just tick the box and we just move next, right? But you do have a document saying that these are your responsibilities. Do you have anything to add to that, Pennie?
Yeah, I think it's important when you are making your application. Obviously, you are talking about the what and the how, and just keeping note of what you have promised that you would deliver. So yeah, I think Ella made a really good point earlier that making documentation throughout the process of your delivery of your project, and yeah, keeping track of what has been delivered and how you have done that. If anything changes, it's like Ellen said, it's fine. Plans do change, things can go wrong, but it's important to actually keep track of what you have changed and why you changed it. So as long as you can, really explain your logic, it's the funder generally will be quite happy to receive report on that process.
Cool, thanks, Pennie. And I drank too much tea. I know you use a bathroom break soon. Can you cover for me? But just really quickly, because there's two questions. One is how much is available for a comic book magazine? And like I mentioned, I'm going to share that document. It's in there under like what the CNZ publication guidelines are. But like Sarah mentioned, it's probably the standard publication. If you think it's in large format, just check with CNZ and say like, can you fund this much? But yeah, currently, I think, she said it's up to date. So they've got 3 examples there of what they can fund up to for the actual physical publication. So it's probably under standards, but it might be large format if the actual size, like she mentioned, it is. And there's another one, where advisors read through draft applications, so they don't, like Sarah just mentioned. But you can, ask take part of it and just ask them if you actually have a question regardless part of it, right? But unfortunately, you can't send them the entire draft application because there'll be conflict of interest. Yeah. So my case study that's a unique case where I'm not assessing, and I'm not an advisor, so it's just between me and the attendee who submitted it. And you guys, but like I said, I redacted the other details, so hopefully it's fine. But yeah, normally they can't. Does anyone have questions or something to share? Do you have anything to share, Pennie? I need a break. I'll be right back. If that's okay.
Sure. Question. Model template. I'm not too sure if I understood that question fully. Chris, do you mind elaborating that? Sorry, Milton, I'll just unmute you. Sorry, Chris, you're muted at the moment.
Unmute, yeah.
There we go.
Did that twice. Sorry, I was just going to ask if there are any model examples or templates of applications that you could follow.
I don't have any readily available, but we can definitely find some and kind of send it through. But in terms of the experience that I have, it's generally more community events and community-based sort of applications. So it's quite a slightly different area that I'm tapping into. But generally speaking, what Allan has gone through, that who, what, how, and how much, those are generally very top line questions you should be able to answer in your application. And one key thing I find that is really important is that try to keep a very top line, and you don't want to overload your application, because I think that's one mistake people tend to make, is that, I'm just going to overload it, include as much information, as much detail, so then people really understand how valuable this application is. But we have to think about, these assessors are going through sometimes tens and sometimes hundreds of application. They don't really have that much time allocated to review each application. So I think that's one key thing just to keep in mind, regardless of what kind of application you're making, just making sure it's quite concise. Yeah, but we're trying to find some model and template that we can share.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see if there was one to do with graphic novels.
Yeah, well, Might need to dig deeper for that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, just be aware. I think sometimes I'll definitely ask for feedback first of all, because you might find, you know, I think one thing we mentioned was don't make assumptions, right? So also don't make assumptions about project being declined, because there might be some reasons. Like, for example, CNZ doesn't have an infinite pot of money. It just, for example, like the funder, you know, it might not be CNZ, but I think every funder doesn't have an infinite pot of money for each round. So it might just be they ran out of money, for example, or you know, some funders have regional focus. So unfortunately, you know, if you're based in Auckland and then there's like, I don't know, 99% of the projects all from Auckland, they might have to take that to account because, you know, there needs to some, you know, checks and balances to cover the rest of New Zealand, right? So there might be like, you know, these kind of external factors that might not be apparent because we're also focused on our idea. And sometimes it seems like, you know, your idea has been rejected, or you yourself as an artist has been attacked, you know, because your project wasn't funded. But you might just find actually it's a pragmatic reason, and you know, it doesn't actually, you didn't actually do anything wrong, but sometimes, you know, it is what it is. But I think the more, you know, it goes back to the contingency I was saying. If you thought the project out, and it reads like, wow, you've got everything sorted, you just need this one last thing, right? And the immediate next steps and towards the goal are already so clear, then sometimes this, you know, you're basically making a proposition that like an assessor can't say no to because you've answered all the questions that they might have had in their mind. So I would say that's probably the best way to, you know, put an application together.
We have a very interesting question in the chat room. So Ben asks, it sounds like there's a lot of comics project planned. Is there a way we can all work together to not step on each other's feet, stack our application or something?
I personally don't think that's an issue. Because I mean, you know, from my experience, I never seen, you know, at least CNZ going, oh, I've got too many. If anything, having more comics projects would mean CNZ would have to approach assessors with experience in that, you know, in that area, more of them to assess that round. So, you know, I don't think it actually hurts your chances. Like I said, you're being assessed against the criteria, not each other, right? But of course, there is, you know, like, you know, as even Sarah mentioned, you do have to take into account what the assessors for each art form might be experienced in. So, but for me, for example, I get asked to assess different art forms too. So no, I'm not just stuck in one. So yeah, I personally don't think that's an issue. Like I said, if you try to make it as objective as possible, so don't take it for granted that like the assessor will know everything there is to know about comics, then you could make sure, I guess you cover your bases in terms of like, even if someone's not super familiar with the genre or art form that you're working in, they can make a quite objective call on whether your project itself is delivering to the strategic outcome that you've selected, right?
Just to add to the point of when your application is getting assessed against a set of criteria, if multiple applications of meet that criteria, I'm not too sure if CNC do this, but I know some other funders will, you know, they will try to fund everyone and maybe just in a reduced amount. So you might not be granted a full amount, but you will still get something. So a lot of times the funders do want to fund good project, and if, you know, if you meet the criteria, they will try to fund you, even if it's just a small portion of it.
Absolutely. So from my experience, okay, so we mainly focus on CNZ today, right? So for CNZ, their criteria is they fund for success. So what that means is if you ask for X amount, they will fund you that X amount. They're not going to say we ran out of money, but we have like a little bit left over. So is this much enough? But Creative Communities, for example, so another funder, for example, might do that. So Creative Communities definitely has cases where, you know, the money is running out, but if your budget indicates that, you know, even if you had this support, it will help the project, they would fund it. So each funder has a different way of doing things. So we mainly talked about CNZ, but there's various funding, bodies that we mentioned. So there's not the only one. They do have an interesting relationship with creative communities. So creative communities essentially is local funding for arts projects. A lot of time primarily for, there's a community outcome, hence creative communities. So there's creative communities like Auckland, creative communities Wellington, creative Waikato. So it's facilitated by the regional council, but the money is actually part of it comes from CNZ. It's mostly funded by CNZ money. So there are some rules around that. So you can't apply to creative communities and CNZ for the same project because it's the same pot of money. But I think creative communities fund lower budget projects, and CNZ at the moment, at least the Arts Grants is higher. So you could go through that route in terms of like getting some track record of funding, especially if your project has like a direct community purpose, right? So for example, the Arts Hui that we're hosting, it's more community focused, and we obviously went to Auckland creative communities because it's we were going to host it physically, but now that we're doing it online, at least our partners Timano are supportive of us doing it through this way, and we have a lot of Aucklanders playing too. What was it? Oh yeah, one other tip I remembered that I was going to say, if you're first time applicant, a common advice is to get support letters from a more experienced, someone more experienced, with more mana, more expertise to write a support letter for you. But something else you could also consider is, you don't have to always make yourself out to be the most successful person and deliver a really ambitious project, right? You can, like I mentioned, for example, if your project needs research, and especially if you are a illustrator, but you want to make a comic for the first time or what have you, it's okay to do some research and, and maybe just ask for funding for that part of it, right? It's okay to say, instead of getting a support letter only, in name, you could say you are needing funding for mentorship, and you ask someone with more experience to be your mentor. So you're funding part of the research, you're funding time that someone more experienced will spend with you to help the project, and you would apply for development of career, right? And those as the strategic outcomes. So I think one good thing, especially if you're putting a funding application together for the first time, is definitely make sure you have that focus. I think we mentioned this briefly before, because if you try to do everything and make it really grand and really ambitious, and you have that thing where it's your first time applying, and maybe you don't have like you've been working in commercial area for primarily in your normal arts practice, and you're doing something independent for the first time, then those are like uphill battles for you to overcome, and you are doing proposing for something ambitious, right? So yeah, but also if you're spending a lot of time and you need to justify that time, so you're asking for like the full amount of your fees. Yeah, so that means you're submitting a project that's very challenging to assess. So I think just don't make it hard on yourself, right? If it's your first time applying. Yeah, does anyone else have questions? Or just something to share? No. Well, we did really good on time. Yeah, I mean, I'm always around if you want some help. Like we're hosting this Hui mainly because I really wanted to do something like this last time, but I was assessing. So that's the problem. If you tell me about your project and then I give you advice, then I obviously have to declare conflict of interest. So I'm not assessing this round. So that makes it a bit easier for me to host something like this. But generally speaking, it doesn't hurt. It's like creating a piece of art. It doesn't hurt to send it to a fellow artist for some critique, because they might have thought of something that you haven't thought about, and you want to avoid those cases where assessor might have a question and you haven't put the answer in your application, so they have to guess. Amy, you have something to say?
Hello, yeah. I think Ara did first though, so maybe go with him first. Yeah.
Oh, Aru.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Oh, you muted if you
Oh,
said it.
Aru, you're muted. Aru, you need to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Hello, everyone.
Hey.
Good afternoon from beautiful Whangarei. How's everybody doing?
Very good.
Hey, Alan, I just want to thank you for inviting and putting this on. It's really cool to have Sarah from from CNZ speak and answer questions. She did. It was quite clear. And thank you for that. When you did that half an hour breakdown of that person's proposal, but it was quite interesting to see. At first, I was like, what? Why would anybody want to do that? And then when you broke it down, I realized that it was a really, really interesting way to actually say, hey, I'm actually quite interested to see this now. And then also the fact that you said that they should approach companies like coffee makers and stuff like that. I was thinking, Jed, Avalanche, that's a great thing. One thing I heard was like, why would CNZ want to apply, have an application for podcasts when anybody could go online on Facebook, on YouTube, on their own thing, use anything and do their own podcast as long as they can invite somebody on it? Why would they need to be a fund for that when the funding could go towards comic books, to books and other things, rather than making another electronic based podcast thing?
Well, I mean, I obviously can't speak on behalf of CNZ, but I think, you'll find that, for example, I don't know, someone from the performing arts sector might say, why don't you fund like more theater instead of like an online comic or something? I think it just comes down to CNZ, they're arts funding body, right? The New Zealand's arts funding body. And essentially, their job is to make sure New Zealanders get to experience more art and or be knowledgeable of more art, and vice versa. They just want to keep they need to keep artists sustainable. So, for example, if you say, hypothetically, like Chromacon wanted to create a podcast where we interview New Zealand artists and talk about their craft and hopefully inspire more young kids to do more art. I personally don't have the time or capacity to do that. But maybe with some funding, I can allocate, instead of doing freelance work, I can allocate that time to do this podcast. And that keeps my, I can pay the rent, it keeps my practice running. So as long as, they're not directly just funding an idea, they're also funding, sustainable careers and practices and just wider community benefits. So just because a project, a podcast is funded doesn't mean it necessarily directly took away money from a comics project. Like Sarah said, it's merit based, and so a podcast might be funded because the idea is amazing, like the actual value it generates is amazing, versus podcast is more valuable than comics versus something else. Amy.
Oh yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh yeah. So I was just gonna say, like, thank you. This is very, very useful. Very useful. I have lots of notes. But yeah, no. I'm thinking, and I think I brought this up in like the Discord chat quite a while back, like with Chromacon, was that it was hard for me to think outside of projects that are beyond anything what I do for Chromacon, like make art at small set scale, sell art at small scale. So like I actually often find I'm like short for ideas for projects. So but in saying that, through this meeting, I was reading more thoroughly what projects have been funded. So at first glance, I see those pages and I'm like, I don't understand what any of this means. But looking at the type of art form it was, so like looking at the specific, this isn't really a question, this is like I discovered something, I just realized. But I'm trying to more open my ideas of like what kind of projects people can either do, even do. So yeah, that's not really a question, but I guess that's like maybe that's a struggle other people are finding, like of not being able to like expand your horizons and what is even like possible. And I guess it's like, if you don't have an idea for a project, then well, you try and get grants funding. But yeah, sometimes I wish I was able to think beyond, like, I'll make some prints and then I'll sell some prints, like into like these larger like worlds. Because it's like I am an artist, but I don't exactly know what to do with any amount of funding. So yeah, yeah, that's just some thoughts I've been thinking about.
Because often time and money is what holds us back, right? If a lot of us have ideas,
Yeah.
and sometimes you shelve ideas because, you know, it's like those two things that are holding you back.
Yeah.
And you might be just building an audience because you're hoping one day to actually do something with that audience, give them something. And so maybe your audience is telling you, I want more of this from you, you know, or yourself, you know, you've got a long-term plan. And I think with like public funding, essentially, think of it as an investment, right? You're asking someone to invest in your idea. It's no different to putting like a Kickstarter together, like for a project, you know. So as crowdfunding becomes more of a common thing, I think folks have realized, hey, you know, like as long as you can communicate exactly what your idea is, and there's a genuine need for this to be out there, right? And genuine need from people who want to, you know, support you and get that piece of art from you somehow in whatever form it might be. Then, yeah, writing an application document, it's the same idea as with writing a Kickstarter,
Yeah.
you know, campaign essentially. So we only mainly focus on CNZ today, but honestly, this applies to like everybody, like every funding body. Versus also, even if you made a web store, you know, it's like, what are you selling? And why are you doing it? You know, it's really good for personal planning, I think.
Yeah, actually, that's kind of a good point. I would say like there's like a fair few artists who like they dabble in art. They got a little bit of an audience. They got a store and stuff, and they're like, what do I do next? What's the thing? So I guess like maybe it's kind of obvious. Ask what your audience wants isn't possibly like a good idea if you have an audience. Yeah, good idea. Thanks, Alan.
I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of use Chromacon as an example because it's
Yeah.
a good deadline for a lot of folks. In
Yeah.
terms of, well, if I already got a booth, then what am I gonna
Yeah,
do?
what am I
What am I
actually-
showcasing?
Yeah.
Actually, that's why our curation process asks you. You know, there's a professionalism criteria, right? And it sounds really like, oh, it's professionalism, but it's honestly, it's like, what is your plan?
Yeah.
Because hopefully you have one, right?
Will you show up with anything at all?
Yeah. And I mean, I suggested Chromacon as something to maybe support arts funding, because you can say, hey, no, because even like Sarah said, what is the end goal? Like, what is the end outcome, right? So, you know, attending a festival might be one. And you could then even say, oh, stage 2, I will take this to a art book fair or a arts festival overseas. There's multitude of ways you could do it. And I think actually, you know, as you get closer and closer to making the idea into reality, more opportunities will come to you, and you know, you could find other ways of funding those. For example, you want to take a project you made to an art fair in Asia, then you might take this project you've got CNZ funding for and go to Asia New Zealand Foundation and say, look at this thing. Like it was you know, this is an awesome idea that I already got funding for. I delivered it. Now it's time. I'm ready to take it to an international audience. So I think you don't necessarily have to have the entire idea, like, you know, conceptualized and you know, pretty much ready to be delivered outright the gate. But you need to identify, like, whoever you're asking for support, you need to, you know, need to have a clear picture of what it is you want to achieve, right? So this might start off with you talking to one other person who might collaborate with you on the project. So similarly, you need to have something like this in writing to say, this is what I want to do. Are you interested in working with me on it? And if you can convince one other person, then, you know, you're sort of at least starting to put together something, you know, convincing a funder or assessors.
Yeah, no, sweet. No, yeah, thanks for that. That was definitely, that's giving me some good things to think about. So, cheers. Cool.
Does anyone else have questions? I'm confused about this raising hand thing, so I'm scared I missed someone. we're good. I mean, we talk a lot about publications today, but it's not the only thing you can apply for funding for. CNZ, for example, currently has it's under the COVID-19 strategy, so they've trimmed down all of the other grants down to just arts grants because there's no international travel right now. So but once things get back to normal, it's worth paying attention to. They have research grants, they have residency grants. So a lot of times, if you even wanted to explore your practice further, there might be opportunities like that for you, right? Eric, yes, thanks.
Yeah, hi. Hey, nice conversation so far, Alan. I just thought I'd add some of my experience. I'm Eric. I'm an event producer, and over the years I've put in many arts grants on different projects. I guess what I'm looking at is the Creative New Zealand want everyone to have a long life in the arts, have a career in the arts. So that's why they're moving towards or have been moving towards that. Are you thinking wider about your project? And there's the important thing of having the art itself, the art form itself, dance or visual arts or whatever it is. But can you enhance that with partnerships? Can you enhance that with, can you grow that sphere? The question asked earlier was, can the group, get together and talk about comics projects, so you're not sort of tripping over each other's toes? That sort of stuff is highly encouraged to sort of try and gather together. And there's different ways to do it with different Facebook groups and so forth. But there is no, going back to another question, doing the template scenario is really difficult because each arts project is very different. But you can look at previous successful grants to get a rhythm of what is funded. The other part of this is play the long game. If you are seriously going to put in to develop a career in the arts, then actually play the long game with this, because you can, as Allan said, you can do small grants for mentorship, for research and so forth, and then that leads on to the following year when you put in another grant for something else, and then you build up a track record of things. Also, just for clarity, I'm also a peer assessor for Creative New Zealand on different projects, and mostly on major events and festivals. But that's a so if you are doing your project, can you join with a major festival or some other presentation partner to help with your exhibition? So go back always to the assessors at Creative New Zealand, get their advice. The ability to network now on Zoom and so forth is so much more expansive and so much more quicker than it ever used to be. So there's almost no excuse for you not to network, and that's going to show up heavily in your application as well, about how many other people you're bringing along for the ride as well, because part of that is developing an ecosystem of the creative industry, and that sort of stuff I know is looked favorably upon, because we all know the arts, even though it may be you that is putting the paintbrush to the canvas, you've got a whole support group behind you as well, and so that's what develops an ecosystem. Not much more to add from that. I mean, there's been a great presentation, Alan, and thanks for putting your time together with us, and Pennie as well.
Thanks so much, Eric. I was waiting for you to chime in. Yeah, like I said, I'll share the document that I had with all the bullet point notes. What else was I going to share? I'll share the template I have for the publications spreadsheet. You can find it on CNZ website, of course. Any questions? I'll send out a survey of some sort, either through Eventbrite or just via our Chromacon channels. It'll probably to do with what other topics everyone would like us to cover for our next Hui. Generally, I feel it should be more of a conversation, hence a Hui. Today is a bit special because there's just so much to cover, and sort of there's the basics. So if we can get through it all, we can cover more in-depth topics in the future. One thing I would like to leave us with, I think, is I was like just don't be discouraged if you don't get funding. Because like I said, I failed like 3 times, and then CNZ asked me to be an assessor. So, you know, I don't know how that works. But you know, but one thing to note is, like, recently, you know, since last year, I was, you know, because I've been progressively trying to do some advocacy work, you know, and I've been sharing, you know, when CNZ runs like Hui's or the sent out surveys, industry surveys, and I've looked at some of the results of the surveys, and I did ask as well. I think a lot of us in our community, they're not, a lot of us might not be aware of stuff like this, and so then you don't end up being represented in the industry surveys or in the future planning and strategic planning of these funding organizations. So it kind of starts from the top, right? And so by the time you start to apply for something, that's when these issues might appear of, say, you know, like potential biases around subject matters or what have you. And I think it's something that CNZ, you know, especially, they're trying to address, because they are obviously publicly funded. But, you know, so actually CNZ, how it works is it's majority from lottery grants, and then Ministry of Arts and Culture funds a portion as well. So, but what I'm trying to say is just try to stay aware of at least when these organizations are doing these like community outreach. So then you can give them direct feedback, right? You know, it's election season. You could talk to local MPs, and, you know, I guess put art as an issue like on the map. Yeah, like Eric said, it's like we're playing the long game, but, you know, I think over time, every time we have a success in our community, it adds to everyone's, you know, track record, basically. You know, like, you know, the comic projects are not competing against each other, right? If we have more comics projects, it's actually demonstrating to CNZ, like, this is what the arts community in New Zealand are doing, you know? So yeah, I think that's what I would like to leave us with, you know? Hopefully we can support each other. Yeah.